The marble halls of the United States Supreme Court had witnessed their share of landmark moments, but nothing quite like the spectacle unfolding on this cold morning in Washington. The great chamber, with its towering Corinthian columns and the ever-watchful frieze of history's lawgivers carved in stone, seemed to hold its breath. Reporters filled the press section, their pens and recorders at the ready. Clerks shuffled papers quietly. The justices took their seats behind the imposing mahogany bench, black robes flowing, their faces set in the usual mask of judicial detachment. And then, the break from precedent. Justice Clarence Thomas, the court's longest-serving member and one of its most formidable conservative voices, was about to do something no one in living memory had seen him do. Use the gravitas of the bench to deliver a personal, unmistakable rebuke, not to an attorney arguing a case, but to an elected member of Congress. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas had entered the chamber earlier with calm confidence. Her tailored navy suit, bold silver earrings, and steady gaze made her stand out among the small delegation of lawmakers who had come to observe oral arguments in Henderson versus State of Georgia, a pivotal case on voting rights. For Crockett, this was not just another day in Washington. This was personal. The case touched the heart of her political identity, protecting the right to vote for marginalized communities. Justice Thomas, at 75, carried the weight of more than 3 decades on the court. He was an ardent originalist, a man who had spent a career defending what he saw as the founders' sacred vision. For years, he had spoken rarely during arguments, letting his written opinions carry his force. But recent years had sharpened him. Ethics scandals, criticism from the press, and the political activism of his wife had left him feeling embattled. Those close to the court described him as more willing now to fight, even from the bench, when he felt the institution's traditions or his own authority were under attack. That morning, his questions to counsel had been unusually aggressive. "It seems to me," Thomas said to the lawyer for the voting rights advocates, his baritone voice cutting through the chamber, "that your clients seek to fundamentally alter the relationship between federal and state authority that has existed since our founding. Isn't that a rather presumptuous position?" Before the lawyer could finish his answer, Thomas pivoted, his gaze shifting deliberately toward the section where the congressional delegation sat. "And I notice," he continued, "that some members of Congress here today seem to share that presumptuous attitude toward our constitutional order." The air in the chamber went still. Every head turned toward the observer's gallery. Crockett felt the weight of 100 stares, but she met Thomas's eyes without flinching. It was an unspoken duel, the old guard's authority against the new guard's defiance. The morning session ended with that tension hanging in the air like static before a lightning strike. After lunch, Thomas returned sharper, his remarks less veiled. "What troubles me," he said, ostensibly addressing the attorneys but clearly aiming beyond them, "is how some today believe that loudness equals legitimacy, that disruption equals progress, that walking into these hallowed halls entitles them to disregard the traditions that have safeguarded this republic for centuries." This time, his glance at Crockett was unmistakable. The room felt smaller, the acoustics amplifying every syllable. Crockett sat straighter, her hands still in her lap, refusing to be diminished. She had spent her career facing down prosecutors, hostile lawmakers, and political opponents. But here she was, in the most sacred legal space in America, being dressed down by one of the most powerful men in the nation, a man who, in her eyes, was clinging to a vision of America that excluded voices like hers. Chief Justice Roberts tried twice to redirect the conversation back to the statutory arguments, but Thomas pressed on. His comments blurred the line between judicial inquiry and political commentary, leaving no doubt to anyone in the chamber that this was more than legal discourse. It was a clash of worldviews. For the next half hour, the back and forth between bench and counsel was secondary. The real drama was in the silent exchange between Clarence Thomas and Jasmine Crockett. A stare, a tightening of the jaw, a raised eyebrow, each moment deepening the sense that this was not just about Henderson versus Georgia. This was about the soul of the American political order, and who got to define respect in a democracy under strain. By the time the gavel fell to adjourn, the marble hall seemed to exhale, but the echoes of that confrontation were already racing toward. The cameras outside, Washington was about to erupt. The air in the Supreme Court chamber felt heavy, as though history itself were leaning in to listen. Justice Thomas's voice carried that familiar tone, the kind meant to sound principled, but laced with something sharper, something aimed directly at her. They understood that democracy requires civility, he intoned, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable echoing off the marble walls. It requires respect for institutions. It requires understanding that some spaces are sacred, and that not every political battle needs to be fought in every venue. He let the sentence hang in the air, as though waiting for it to settle on the audience like a moral burden. His gaze swept briefly across the chamber before returning to his notes. Some people, he continued, seem to confuse their temporary political power with permanent moral authority. They mistake their ability to command attention for the right to command respect. The implication was crystal clear and unmistakably personal. Representative Jasmine Crockett felt the heat of dozens of eyes on her, reporters scribbling. In the gallery, lawyers sitting stiffly at their tables, court officers standing at attention. She could hear the faint rustle of whispers from somewhere behind her. And under that hum, she felt something else. The weight of every time someone in power had told her to sit down, to know her place, to be quiet while the adults talked. Thomas kept going, his voice dripping with the gravitas of someone convinced he was the custodian of American tradition. These chambers have witnessed great legal minds for over 2 centuries. They have hosted debates that shaped our nation. They deserve better than to be treated as just another political stage by people who should know better. She knew exactly who he meant. Crockett's eyes flicked around the room. The tall marble columns that seemed to rise endlessly, the ceiling painted with intricate patterns meant to evoke reverence, the portraits of justices past that lined the walls. All white, men until very recently. Every detail of the room seemed designed to remind her of her smallness in the face of its grand tradition. But she also thought about the people who had been kept out of this chamber for most of its history. Black citizens who weren't even allowed to enter. Women who couldn't practice law, much less argue cases here. Working-class families whose legal fights never reached this level because justice at this altitude cost more than they could ever afford. And now, Thomas was lecturing her about respecting tradition, a tradition that had systematically excluded the very people she represented. What about respect for progress? What about respect for the voices that tradition had tried to silence? The afternoon session was winding down. If she didn't act now, the moment would pass, and Thomas's public rebuke would go unanswered. She made her decision. As Thomas began what was clearly his final set of remarks, less about the legal matter at hand and more about her, she pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped across the floor, the sharp sound slicing through the room's silence like a blade. Every head turned. Chief Justice Roberts's brows shot up. Justice Thomas froze mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. The court clerk stopped, writing. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. Protocol demanded she remain seated and silent. Tradition insisted she defer to the authority of the bench. But Crockett had spent her career standing up in rooms where she wasn't supposed to speak. She rose to her feet. Her voice was calm, steady, and just loud enough to carry to the far corners of the chamber. Your Honor, with all due respect, the entire chamber seemed to freeze in place. Thomas's voice came back like a whip crack. Congresswoman, you are out of order. This is not the House floor. You will sit down immediately. But Crockett didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, planting herself like a litigator at the opening of a cross-examination. "With all due respect, Justice Thomas, I cannot sit silently while you use this bench to attack my character and question my right to be here." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Court officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene in a breach of decorum the court hadn't seen in 234 years. Thomas leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "Ms. Crockett, you are disrespecting this institution and everything it stands for. I suggest you remember where you are." She met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly where I am. I'm in the People's Court, the court that belongs to every American citizen, not just the ones whose faces look like the portraits behind you." She gestured toward the wall, lined with the likenesses of long-dead justices, a silent gallery of white male power. "You talk about respecting tradition. But what tradition are we respecting? The tradition that kept people like me out of this building. The tradition that said Black Americans couldn't be lawyers, couldn't be judges, couldn't even be full citizens?" Thomas's knuckles turned white as he gripped the bench. "You are completely out of line. Security should remove you immediately." But before anyone could move, she went on, her voice growing stronger. "You want to talk about disrespecting institutions, Justice Thomas? Let's talk about respect." From her bag, she pulled out her phone, another breach of protocol that drew audible gasps. "Let's talk about the $267,000 in unreported gifts you've received from Republican donors. Let's talk about the luxury vacations on Harlan Crow's yacht, the private jet flights, the real estate deals involving your mother's home. Let's talk about the RV loan that magically disappeared. Let's talk about your wife's text, messages to the White House Chief of Staff on January 6th while you were sitting on cases about that very election." Each fact landed like a gavel strike. She had done her homework, and the details were so precise that no one could dismiss them as political bluster. Thomas shot to his feet, his robe flaring out like a storm cloud. "How dare you? This is not the place for your political grandstanding." "You made it political," Crockett fired back, her voice cutting through the noise. "When you decided to use your position to attack me personally instead of focusing on the law. You want to lecture me about ethics and respect? You've been ethically compromised for years. The only reason you're still on this bench is because your friends in the Senate refuse to hold you accountable." The chamber erupted into chaos. Other justices shifted uncomfortably. Chief Justice Roberts' gavel struck again and again, but it was like trying to stop a storm with a pebble. "You say I don't belong here," Crockett continued, "that I'm disrespecting sacred traditions. But what's truly disrespectful is a judge who takes bribes and calls them gifts. What's truly disrespectful is using your lifetime appointment to settle political scores instead of interpreting the law." Thomas was trembling now, pointing at her. "You are a disgrace to the legal profession. You don't understand the dignity this position requires." Crockett let out a short, humorless laugh. "Dignity? Dignity isn't about marble columns and fancy portraits. Dignity is about integrity, something you traded away for vacations, gifts, and political favors." And in that moment, the chamber knew. This was no longer just an exchange between a justice and a congresswoman. This was history being written in real time. The courtroom air was already tense, but it snapped taut the moment Crockett's voice cut through the silence. "Sir," she began, her tone icy but controlled, "you forfeited your dignity the moment you accepted money from individuals with active cases before this court. You lost it again when you refused to recuse yourself from matters entangled with your wife's political activities. You want to stand here and talk about dignity? I suggest you look in the mirror." The words landed like a hammer strike in the marbled chamber. For a breathless beat, no one moved. Then, as if a collective fuse had burned down to its final spark, the public gallery erupted. Applause burst forth, sharp, echoing claps from every corner. Court officers sprang into motion, shouting for order. but it was too late. The spell of courtroom decorum had been shattered. Law students, journalists, and everyday citizens, people who had queued before dawn for the rare chance to watch democracy unfold in its highest arena, were making it clear whose side they stood on. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, a first-year SAPA Georgetown law student, still clutching her case notes in one hand as she clapped. She'd woken at 4 a.m. to secure her seat. "I couldn't help myself," she told reporters later, cheeks flushed with excitement. "It was like watching history happen. Someone finally said out loud what we've all been thinking." Down in the front row sat retired Judge William Hayes, his dark suit pressed to perfection, his gavel days long behind him. Tears welled in his eyes as he joined the ovation. "In 60 years of legal practice," he would say afterward, "I never believed I'd see someone speak truth to power like that, especially here in the Supreme Court." Justice Thomas's face had gone crimson, his jaw set so tightly it looked carved from stone. "Clear the gallery," he barked. "Clear it now." But Crockett didn't yield. Her voice rose above the chaos, steady and defiant. "Justice Thomas, you can clear this gallery," she declared, "but you cannot clear the truth. You cannot erase the fact that millions of Americans are watching right now and seeing exactly who you are." Security advanced, but she stood firm. Then came her killing blow. "You accuse me of disrespecting tradition," she continued, each word deliberate. "But the tradition you defend isn't constitutional law or judicial dignity. It's the tradition of powerful men silencing women and minorities who dare to speak. It's the tradition of wrapping corruption in respectability. It's the tradition of telling people like me we should be grateful just to be here, and that we must never, ever challenge injustice when we see it." Her voice softened to a whisper that somehow carried across every corner of the chamber. "Well, sir, that tradition ends today. I am not here to be quiet. I am here to represent the people who sent me, and they deserve better than a compromised justice who believes his robes. Make him untouchable." Thomas trembled with fury. "Get her out of here. Get her out now." Crockett calmly gathered her papers, slipping them into her bag. She looked directly at him one last time, her expression almost gentle. "Justice Thomas," she said quietly, "I hope one day you remember what it means to serve the people rather than yourself. The law demands better. The American people demand better. And even you deserve better than this." As she walked toward the heavy double doors, the murmurs and chaos behind her seemed to fade. Justice Thomas slumped into his chair, the fire in his eyes dimming into something older, heavier. Chief Justice Roberts's voice, barely audible, called for a recess. At the door, Crockett turned once more, scanning the justices, the clerks, the spectators, every soul in the room. "The people are watching," she said. "They've always been watching. And they won't forget." The doors closed with a muted click that somehow sounded like a gunshot in the stunned silence that followed. Outside, the marble hallways of the Supreme Court were suddenly a riot of motion. Reporters swarmed. Smartphones glowed with breaking alerts. Within minutes, hashtags exploded across social media. Crockett vs. Thomas, shocker justice for Jasmine, shocker Thomas exposed. Someone inside had live-streamed the entire exchange despite strict court rules. Clips flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, view counts, climbing into the millions before Crockett even reached the courthouse steps. "I just watched Representative Jasmine Crockett destroy Clarence Thomas," one law student tweeted. She said what we've all been thinking. Fearless. The tweet alone gathered over 100,000 likes in under an hour. On the courthouse steps, the press scrum surged forward. "Representative Crockett, do you regret confronting Justice Thomas?" CNN called out. "I regret that it was necessary," she replied, her voice as steady as it had been inside. But when a Supreme Court justice chooses to attack a sitting member of Congress instead of focusing on the law, someone has to speak up. "What about claims you disrespected the court?" a Fox News reporter pressed. Crockett didn't flinch. "Real disrespect," she said, "is taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported gifts from political donors. Real disrespect is refusing to recuse yourself from cases tied to your spouse's political work. Real disrespect is using a lifetime appointment to settle personal scores instead of serving the American people." Her words ricocheted through the crowd, through cameras, through every social feed in the country. Back on Capitol Hill, the shockwaves hit both sides of the aisle. Progressives rallied immediately, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeting, "Jasmine Crockett did what needed to be done." Clarence Thomas has been ethically compromised for years, proud to serve alongside her. Bernie Sanders followed. While Thomas lectures on respect, he takes luxury gifts from billionaire donors. The people deserve better from our highest court. Republicans, however, called for consequences. House Speaker Mike Johnson condemned her remarks as a disgraceful attack on judicial independence. Senator Ted Cruz demanded a formal ethics investigation into her conduct. Inside the court, Chief Justice Roberts convened an emergency meeting of all 9 justices, the first in living memory prompted by a public outburst during oral arguments. According to sources, Thomas urged a public statement condemning Crockett and barring her from future appearances. But outside those walls, the narrative had already taken root, and it was one Thomas could not control. By the final week of the blockade, Burkina Faso's strategy was no longer just a defensive measure. It had become a symbol of defiance for an entire continent. Agreements with Ghana, Togo, and Benin were now fully operational, creating an unbroken lifeline of goods into the country. These alternative routes were not only keeping the economy alive, they were sending a powerful message to Ivory Coast. Burkina Faso will never again be held hostage by a single trade partner. Analysts in regional capitals began to speculate that these new routes might outlast the crisis entirely, permanently reshaping West Africa's commercial map. At this pivotal moment, France attempted to intervene. The French government worried that the blockade was destabilizing the region and threatening Paris's own influence in West Africa, sent urgent messages to both Abidjan and Ouagadougou. President Alassane Ouattara was told bluntly, "End this crisis before it spirals further." At the same time, Captain Ibrahim Traoré received a more subtle warning from French diplomats. "Do not go too far. A drawn-out conflict will harm everyone." But Traoré was unmoved. In a televised statement that would later be replayed across African media, he declared, "This is an African matter, and Africa will resolve it without external interference." That single line electrified Pan-Africanist movements from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Social media lit up with messages praising him as the man who told France to step aside. On the 28th day, after weeks of mounting economic damage, the first cracks appeared in Abidjan's position. President Ouattara, speaking at a press briefing, conceded for the first time that if mistakes were made, they will be corrected. It was the first public signal that Ivory Coast was ready to back down. The following day, the ECOWAS summit convened in Accra, Ghana, with both leaders present. Cameras captured the tense arrival of each delegation, the long hours behind closed doors, and the hushed speculation in the corridors. The breakthrough came during a marathon 12-hour negotiation session. Midway through, in a moment that would later be described as the turning point, Ouattara publicly apologized. "We wronged our Burkinabe brothers, and for that, we are sorry." Witnesses say Traoré remained silent for several seconds before nodding slowly, a gesture that signaled the deadlock was broken. On the 30th day, the agreement was formally signed. The 5-point deal reopened borders immediately, mandated compensation for past economic losses, outlawed discriminatory trade practices, created a joint trade oversight committee, and scheduled annual summits to prevent future disputes. At precisely 12 p.m. on